Sometimes the hardest person to save is yourself. Sometimes it takes meeting someone else who's walked your path to find the strength you never knew you had. Clara walks into the small-town clinic with a swollen ear. She's pregnant and trying to act like everything is fine. But Helen, the nurse, sees through the act. She notices how Clara jumps at sudden sounds and the way she holds herself like someone who's been hurt before. Helen knows these signs because she lived them 30 years ago. In that quiet exam room, two women discover they share a painful bond. Clara is carrying new life and desperately wants a different future for her child. Helen sees a chance to help in ways she wished someone had helped her. What will it take for Clara to break free before it's too late? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Clara Whitmore's kitchen, casting delicate patterns across the worn linoleum floor. At 42, she moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to anticipate every creak in the floorboards, every shadow that might betray her presence. Her hand rested instinctively on the gentle curve of her belly 5 months along now, though she'd only begun to show in recent weeks. 15 years of marriage had taught Clara many things. How to make coffee without waking Marcus. How to fold his shirts exactly the way he preferred. How to explain away the bruises that seemed to appear with increasing frequency since she'd told him about the baby. Another accident-prone phase, she would tell herself. The same lie she'd whispered to mirrors and concerned neighbors for years. But this pregnancy felt different. This tiny life growing inside her demanded something she'd forgotten how to give herself hope. Clara's wedding ring caught the morning light as she buttered Marcus's toast. The simple gold band had once symbolized promise and protection. Now it felt more like a shackle, loose enough that she could twist it nervously around her finger, tight enough that she'd never seriously considered removing it. The diamond engagement ring sat beside it, a modest stone that Marcus had proudly presented 20 years ago when they were both young and believed in fairy tales. She'd been 22 then, working at the local library, dreaming of maybe moving to the city someday. Marcus had been charming, attentive, everything a small-town girl could want. He promised to take care of her, to build them a life together in Millbrook, population 3,847. He'd kept that promise in his way. The house was paid for. The bills were always current. She never wanted for material things. What she wanted for now was something much more elusive. The sound of Marcus's heavy footsteps on the stairs made her shoulders tense involuntarily. She arranged her face into the pleasant, neutral expression that had become her default. Not too happy, which might seem suspicious, not too sad, which might invite questions she wasn't ready to answer. "Morning, sweetheart," Marcus said, his voice carrying that particular tone that meant he was in a good mood. These were the mornings Clara treasured, when she could almost remember why she'd fallen in love with him. He was a handsome man still, 45 years old with salt and pepper hair and the broad shoulders that came from 20 years of construction work. In moments like these, she could see glimpses of the man who had once made her laugh. "Coffee's ready," she replied, sliding his plate across the kitchen table. "And I made extra eggs, just how you like them." Marcus settled into his chair with the satisfied grunt of a man whose world operated exactly as he expected it should. He opened the morning paper, another ritual in their carefully choreographed dance. Clara knew better than to speak during his reading time unless directly addressed. She busied herself with her own breakfast, though her appetite had been unreliable throughout this pregnancy. The baby seemed to have strong opinions about what she should eat, rejecting food she'd always enjoyed while craving things that made no sense. Yesterday, she'd found herself staring longingly at the jar of pickles in the refrigerator, wondering if it was too early in the morning for such indulgences. "Doctor's appointment today?" Marcus asked without looking up from the sports section. Just a routine checkup, Clara replied carefully. Helen said I should come in every few weeks now that I'm in the second trimester. Marcus nodded, apparently satisfied. Helen Rodriguez had been the head nurse at Millbrook Community Clinic for 30 years, and even Marcus respected her medical authority. It was one of the few areas where Clara was allowed some autonomy, her health care, though even that came with unspoken boundaries. Never mention the bruises. Never ask about birth control. Never suggest that stress might be affecting the pregnancy. Clara had mastered the art of careful omission. The drive to the clinic took 12 minutes through Millbrook's quiet streets. Clara knew every turn, every pothole, every house where someone might wave from their front porch. This was both the blessing and curse of small-town life, the deep familiarity that could feel like home or like a prison, depending on what secrets you carried. She parked in the clinic's small lot, taking a moment to check her appearance in the rearview mirror. The swelling around her left ear had gone down some since yesterday, but makeup could only do so much. She'd practice her explanation. One more time. She'd been rushing to get laundry off the line before the rain started. Hadn't seen the low-hanging branch. Such a silly accident. The clinic's waiting room smelled of antiseptic and old magazines, comforting in its reliability. Mrs. Patterson was there with her grandson's scraped knee. Mr. Chun waited patiently for his blood pressure medication refill. Normal people dealing with normal problems in normal ways. Clara signed in at the reception desk and took a seat, one hand unconsciously moving to her belly. The baby had been more active lately, small flutters and kicks that reminded her she wasn't alone anymore. Someone else depended on her now, someone who deserved better than the legacy of fear she'd inherited from her own childhood. Her mother had stayed. 37 years married to a man who believed wives should be grateful for whatever kindness they received. Clara had sworn she'd be different, but somehow she'd found herself following the same script, making the same excuses, accepting the same diminished version of love. But this baby changed everything. This baby deserved a mother who stood up, a mother who fought back, a mother who knew her own worth. The question was whether Clara could remember how to be that woman. Helen Rodriguez emerged from the back corridor, her medical badge catching the fluorescent light as she moved. At 58, Helen carried herself with the quiet authority that came from decades of caring for others. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her scrubs were pressed and professional. But her eyes, Clara had always noticed. Helen's eyes held a kindness that seemed deeper than mere bedside manner. "Clara, honey, come on back," Helen said with a warm smile that somehow made the clinical environment feel more human. As Clara followed Helen down the familiar hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different. Something in Helen's expression, a certain intentness in the way she watched Clara move, suggested that the careful performance Clara had perfected might finally be reaching its end. The examination room door closed behind them with a soft click. And for the first time in months, Clara felt like she could breathe just a little deeper. Here, in this small, sterile space, maybe she could stop pretending that everything was fine. Maybe she could start admitting that it wasn't. Helen's medical badge gleamed under the examination room lights. 30 years of service reflected in its worn edges and familiar weight. She'd pinned it on for the first time as a young woman, fresh from nursing school, ready to heal the world. She'd never imagined then how many different kinds of healing that would require. The badge had witnessed her own transformation from victim to survivor to healer. It had been there through her divorce, through late nights when she'd held Umlin's hands as they made impossible decisions, through moments when her professional oath demanded she see what others preferred to ignore. Today, looking at Clara's carefully composed face, Helen knew the badge would witness another kind of reckoning. Some truths couldn't stay buried forever, and some silences became louder than screams. The time for careful dancing around the obvious was coming to an end. "Let's start with the basics," Helen said, her voice carrying the practiced calm of someone who had conducted thousands of these appointments. "How are you feeling overall? Oh, any new concerns since your last visit?" Clara settled onto the examination table, the paper crinkling beneath her. "I'm feeling good, mostly. The morning sickness is finally easing up. But I had a little accident yesterday. Hit my ear on a tree branch while I was taking down laundry. It's been swollen and tender." Helen nodded, making notes on Clara's chart. But her experienced eyes had already begun their own examination, noting details that Clara's careful words didn't address. The way she favored her left side when she sat down. The faint yellow discoloration along her jawline that makeup couldn't quite conceal. The unconscious way her hand moved to protect her ribs when she breathed deeply. "Let me take a look at that ear," Helen said, pulling on latex gloves with practiced efficiency. She positioned the otoscope and gently examined the swollen area. The injury was real enough tender, inflamed, consistent with blunt force trauma. But Helen's trained eye saw something else entirely. The angle was wrong for a tree branch. "Clara, honey, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that anything you tell me stays between us unless you give me permission otherwise." Helen's voice was steady, professional, but there was something underneath a warmth that suggested personal understanding rather than clinical detachment. Clara's body tensed immediately. "I already told you what happened." "I wasn't paying attention, and I walked right into that low branch. Marcus is always telling me to be more careful, especially now with the baby." Helen pulled Clara's medical file from the counter and opened it slowly, deliberately. The pages rustled in the quiet room as she flipped through months and years of documented visits. "I've been your nurse for 5 years now, since you moved your care here from Dr. Morrison's practice. You've had quite a few accidents in that time." The silence stretched between them. Clara stared at her hands, twisting her wedding round. And around her finger, October of last year sprained wrist from slipping on wet leaves. March bruised ribs from falling down the stairs. June cut lip from walking into a cabinet door. Helen's voice remained gentle, but each entry landed like a stone thrown into still water. "And now this ear injury from a tree branch. I've always been clumsy," Clara whispered, "even as a child. My mother used to say I could trip over my own shadow." Helen closed the file and sat down on the rolling stool, bringing herself to Clara's eye level. This was the moment that separated good nurses from great ones. The willingness to step beyond medical protocol into the Messier territory of human truth. "Clara, I want to show you something." Helen pulled out a small hand mirror from the supply cabinet. "Look at your hands for me." Reluctantly, Clara held up her hands. In the bright examination room light, the defensive wounds were clearly visible small cuts across her knuckles. A healing scratch on her palm, the telltale marks of someone who had raised her hands to protect herself. "These aren't from tree branches or cabinet doors," Helen said quietly. "I know because I used to have marks just like these." The words hung in the air between them, like a bridge neither woman was quite ready to cross. Clara's breathing became shallow, rapid. Her carefully constructed facade began to crack around the edges. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," Helen interrupted gently. "I'm telling you that I recognize the signs because I lived them. 30 years ago, I sat in a room not unlike this one, making excuses for injuries that had nothing to do with my own clumsiness." Clara's hands began to shake. The wedding ring slipped around her finger, loose from weight loss and stress. "Marcus loves me. He takes care of me. He gets frustrated sometimes, especially with the pregnancy. He didn't plan on having a baby at this stage of our lives." "Clara, how did you really hurt your ear?" The question was simple, direct, Impossible to deflect with another rehearsed explanation. Clara stared at the mirror in her hands, seeing not just her reflection, but the accumulation of years spent perfecting the art of invisible survival. He was angry about the phone bill, she whispered, her voice so quiet Helen had to lean forward to hear. Said I'd been talking too long to my sister in Denver. He grabbed my head to make me look at him while he was yelling, and his class ring caught my ear. It wasn't, he didn't mean to hurt me. Not really. The admission hung between them like a confession, terrible and liberating at the same time. Clara had never said the words out loud before. She'd never allowed herself to connect Marcus's anger directly to her injuries. There had always been some buffer, some way to make it her fault, or an accident, or a misunderstanding. Helen reached out slowly, telegraphing her movement so Clara wouldn't startle, and gently touched her shoulder. Thank you for telling me the truth. That took courage. It doesn't feel like courage, Clara said, tears beginning to fall. It feels like betrayal. Of who? Of Marcus. Of our marriage. Of the life we've built together. Helen was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. Clara, I need to document this conversation in your medical file. Not because I want to get you in trouble, but because there might come a time when you need evidence of what's been happening. Would that be okay with you? Clara's head shot up, panic flashing in her eyes. No, you can't. If Marcus ever found out that I told you, he won't find out from me, Helen said firmly. Medical records are confidential. But I need you to think about something. What kind of world do you want your baby to be born into? The question landed like a physical blow. Clara's hand moved instinctively to her belly, to the life growing there who had no voice in the circumstances of their creation, but who would inherit whatever environment Clara chose to provide. I want my baby to be safe, Clara whispered. Then, we need to talk about what that means. The clinic phone rang in the distance, its shrill sound cutting through the quiet of the examination room. Then it rang again and again. Helen's expression tightened. I need to check on that. The receptionist must be away from her desk. She stepped into the hallway, and Clara could hear her answering the phone with professional courtesy. Millbrook Community Clinic. This is Helen. A pause. Yes, she's here for her appointment. No, I can't discuss a patient's medical information over the phone, even with family members. Another pause. Longer this time. Sir, I understand your concern, but Mrs. Whitmore's appointment will take as long as it needs to take. Standard prenatal visits can run 30 to 45 minutes. Clara's blood ran cold. Marcus was calling the clinic. He was checking up on her, timing her appointment, making sure she didn't stray from the approved script of their life together. Helen returned to the room, her face carefully neutral, but her eyes flashing with something that looked like controlled anger. That was your husband. What did he want? To know how much longer your appointment would take. He seemed concerned that it was running long. Clara's whole body began to tremble. I have to go. I can't. He'll know something's wrong if I'm late. He'll ask questions. Clara, wait. Helen moved to the door, partially blocking Clara's exit. Not trapping her, but creating a moment of pause. I want you to have something. She pulled a small card from her pocket, plain white, with just a phone number written in blue ink. This is my personal cell phone. If you ever need anything, a ride, a safe place to stay, someone to talk to, you can call me. Anytime, day or night. Clara stared at the card as if it were a dangerous thing. I can't take that. You don't have to use it. But you can keep it, just in case. With trembling fingers, Clara took the card and slipped it into the small interior pocket of her purse, the one where she kept her emergency cash and her insurance card, things Marcus never thought to check. I need to document what we discussed today, Helen said gently. Not the details of what Marcus did, but the fact that we talked about home safety and domestic violence resources. It will be coded in a way that protects your privacy but establishes a record. Is that acceptable? Clara nodded, unable to speak. The weight of what had just happened, the admission, the card, the breaking of her carefully maintained silence felt enormous and terrifying and somehow necessary all at once. Clara, you're not alone in this. I want you to remember that, especially on the hard days. As Clara gathered her purse and prepared to leave, she caught sight of herself in the examination room mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed both familiar and strange, the same face she'd worn for 15 years of marriage, but something had shifted. Some invisible barrier had been crossed. She was no longer the only one who knew the truth about her life. Walking to her car, Clara felt the weight of Helen's card in her purse like a secret talisman. For the first time in years, she carried with her the concrete possibility of a different future. The question now was whether she would have the courage to reach for it before that future was decided for her. The baby stirred inside her, a gentle reminder that time was running short and choices were becoming unavoidable. In less than 4 months, she would hold her child in her arms. What kind of mother would she be by then? What kind of woman would she choose to become? The drive home from the clinic felt different somehow, as if the familiar streets of Millbrook had shifted slightly while Clara was inside that examination room. The same houses lined the road. The same neighbors tended their gardens, but Clara carried with her now the weight of spoken truth and the dangerous comfort of knowing someone else understood. Helen's card seemed to burn through the leather of her purse where it sat hidden in the small interior pocket. Clara had memorized the number during the drive, 10 digits that represented possibility and terror in equal measure. Marcus's truck was in the driveway when she arrived home, which meant he'd knocked off work early. Her stomach clenched as she pulled up beside it, noting the way he'd parked at an angle that blocked her usual spot, a small assertion of control that she'd learned not to challenge. How was the appointment? He asked before she'd even closed the front door. He was sitting in his recliner, still wearing his work clothes, a beer already open in his hand, despite it being barely past noon. Fine, everything's normal. The baby's measuring right on schedule. Clara kept her voice light, practiced. Helen said I might start feeling more movement in the next few weeks. Marcus nodded, seeming satisfied with this response. Good. I worry about you driving yourself to these appointments. Maybe I should start taking you. The suggestion landed like ice water in Clara's veins. Oh, you don't need to do that. I know how busy work is for you. Besides, they're pretty routine now, just weight checks and listening to the heartbeat. Still, Marcus said, taking a long pull from his beer. A man should be involved in his child's development. Maybe I'll come to the next one. Clara busied herself putting away her purse, making sure the hidden pocket was securely closed. Of course, whatever you think is best. But even as she said the words, she was calculating. The next appointment was in 3 weeks. 3 weeks to figure out how to protect the fragile seed of honesty that had been planted today. Later that evening, after Marcus had fallen asleep. In front of the television, Clara found herself drawn to the small desk in her bedroom where she kept household bills and correspondence. Buried beneath insurance papers and utility statements was something she hadn't looked at in years, her marriage certificate. Yellowed at the edges and bearing the optimistic signatures of 2 young people who believed love would be enough. Next. To it, almost forgotten, were her divorce papers. Not from Marcus, from her first marriage. A brief union when she was barely 19 to a boy named Tommy who joined the army and never came home the same. That marriage had lasted 18 months before Clara found the courage to leave, recognizing even then that love without respect was just another form of prison. She'd hidden these papers from Marcus, not out of deception, but out of shame. In the small, conservative community where they lived, divorce was still whispered about, still carried the weight of failure. Marcus knew about Tommy in general terms, but he'd never seen the legal documents that proved Clara had once been strong enough to choose. herself over a harmful situation, Dot looking at her own signature on those old papers, bold, confident, unapologetic. Clara barely recognized the woman who had once wielded such certainty. When had she become someone who made excuses for other people's cruelty? When had she learned to make herself smaller to avoid conflict? Meanwhile, across town, Helen Rodriguez sat in her small apartment above the pharmacy, trying to shake off the emotional residue of her conversation with Clara. 30 years of nursing had taught her to maintain professional boundaries, but some cases broke through those walls and took up residence in her heart. She pulled out a wooden box from beneath a bed, one she hadn't opened in months. Inside were the remnants of her own escape photographs of bruises she'd documented, letters from the lawyer who'd helped her navigate her divorce, and most importantly, a journal she'd kept during the darkest period of her life. The journal. Entries were brief, coded in the language of someone who couldn't risk discovery. Bad day meant Harold had been drinking. Rough night meant she'd slept on the couch to avoid his anger. Accident meant exactly what Clara's accidents meant, but interspersed between the carefully neutral observations were flashes of the woman Helen had been before fear taught her to hide. March 15th, 1994. I deserve better than this. April 3rd, 1994. My mother raised me to be strong. Where did that woman go? May 22nd, 1994. I can't live like this forever. Something has to change. Reading her own words from 3 decades ago, Helen was struck by how clearly she'd seen her situation, even while feeling powerless to change it. The awareness had been there long before the courage arrived. She'd finally left Harold on a Tuesday in August 1994, not because of any dramatic incident or final straw, but because she'd woken up that morning and realized she'd rather be alone and poor than partnered and afraid. The divorce had been ugly, expensive, and worth every penny. Helen had never remarried. She'd dated occasionally over the years, but she'd never again confused the desperate need to be taken care of with the mature desire to share a life with someone. Independence, she'd learned, was not the same as loneliness. But seeing Clara today pregnant, vulnerable, trapped in the same cycle Helen had once known so intimately, had awakened something protective and fierce. Clara was exactly the age Helen had been when she finally found the strength to leave. The parallel was too striking to ignore. Helen reached for her laptop and began researching domestic violence resources in their area. The options were limited in a rural community, but there were shelters within driving distance, legal aid services, support groups. She made careful notes, preparing for the conversation she hoped Clara would be ready to have soon. As she worked, Helen found herself thinking about the young nurse she'd been when she first started at the clinic, idealistic, determined to save everyone who came through those doors. Experience had taught her humility, had shown her that healing happened on the patient's timeline, not the caregiver's. But it had also taught her that sometimes the smallest acts of witness and support could plant seeds that bloomed months or years later. Clara Whitmore might not be ready to leave today, or tomorrow, or even next month, but she was ready to admit the truth, and that was where every journey toward freedom began. Back at the Whitmore house, Clara carefully returned the divorce papers to their hiding place and prepared for bed. Marcus stirred as she slipped under the covers, reaching for her in the unconscious way of long-married couples. "Everything okay?" he mumbled, still half asleep. "Everything's fine," Clara whispered, the lie coming as easily as breathing. But for the first time in years, she wondered what it would feel like to tell him the truth instead. To say, "No, everything is not fine. I'm afraid of you. I'm afraid for our baby. I'm afraid of who I've become in this marriage, but not tonight." Tonight, she would hold Helen's phone number close and remember that somewhere in this small town was a woman who understood. Someone who had walked this path and found her way to the other side. It wasn't much, but it was more hope than Clara had carried in years. And sometimes, Hope was enough to keep you moving forward until courage arrived to show you the way. 3 days after her appointment with Helen, Clara made her first act of quiet rebellion. It was small, almost insignificant. She bought a package of saltine crackers at the grocery store without adding them to the list. Marcus reviewed each week, but as she slipped the crackers into the baby's room and hid them behind a stack of receiving blankets, her heart pounded as if she'd committed grand theft. The crackers weren't for herself. They were for the future, a small stockpile of food that Marcus couldn't monitor or control. Clara had read somewhere that domestic violence often escalated during pregnancy, and she'd begun to notice the truth of this in her own life. Marcus's questions had become more frequent, his monitoring more intense. He'd started checking the mileage on her car after errands, calling the clinic to verify appointment times, questioning every dollar spent. But he hadn't yet thought to search the baby's room. The nursery represented hope to him, possibility, legacy. It was the one space in their house that he approached with genuine tenderness, running his hands over the crib he'd assembled himself, talking about teaching his son to throw a baseball, or his daughter to ride a bike. Clara used his blind spot. Over the next week, she added small items to her hidden cache: a package of granola bars, a few bottles of water, $20 from the change jar Marcus rarely counted. Nothing that would be missed individually, but together they represented something powerful, the possibility of survival independent of his provision. She told herself she was just being prepared. Pregnant women should have snacks available. It wasn't betrayal. It was common sense. But late at night, when Marcus slept beside her and she felt the baby moving inside her, Clara allowed herself to imagine a different purpose for her secret supplies. Emergency food for a journey, resources for an escape, provisions for a life where she made decisions based on her own judgment rather than someone else's approval. The fantasy felt both impossible and inevitable. Meanwhile, Helen found herself thinking about Clara at unexpected moments throughout her days. While taking Mrs. Patterson's blood pressure, she wondered if Clara was feeling well. While restocking medical supplies, she thought about resources Clara might need. While eating dinner alone in her apartment, she remembered the look in Clara's eyes when she'd finally admitted the truth about her ear injury. Helen had learned over the years to trust her instincts about patients who needed extra attention. Sometimes it was medical elderly people who weren't taking their medications properly, diabetics who were struggling with dietary compliance. Other times it was situational teenagers dealing with depression, new mothers overwhelmed by postpartum anxiety. Clara fell into a category Helen knew all too well: women whose medical needs were inseparable from their safety needs. On Thursday afternoon, Helen's curiosity got the better of her professional restraint. During her lunch break, she drove past the Whitmore house, not to spy, exactly, but to better understand the environment Clara returned to each day after their conversations about prenatal care and infant nutrition. The house was modest, but well-maintained. A small 2-story colonial with neat flower beds and fresh paint. Marcus's construction skills were evident in the careful attention to detail, the perfectly aligned fence posts, the professionally installed porch railing, the landscaping that suggested both pride and control. Helen could see why neighbors would consider the Whitmores a solid, successful couple. From the outside, everything looked exactly as it should. The deception was in what couldn't be seen from the street, the atmosphere inside, the careful negotiations required for daily survival, the way love had been confused with possession. As Helen sat in her car across the street, she saw Marcus's truck pull into the driveway. He emerged from the vehicle with the confident stride of a man who owned his world completely. When Clara appeared at the front door to greet him, Helen watched their interaction with the trained eye of someone who knew how to read between the lines of domestic theater. Clara's posture was deferential, slightly apologetic. Marcus's body, Language was proprietary, protective in a way that also suggested ownership. The conversation was brief, probably Clara explaining some aspect of her day, Marcus evaluating whether her account met his standards for acceptable behavior. It was a dance Helen recognized, having performed it herself for years. That evening, Helen called her sister Margaret in Phoenix, something she did every few weeks to maintain their connection across the miles. "You sound distracted," Margaret observed after they'd covered the usual topics: weather, work, Margaret's grandchildren. "Everything okay?" Helen hesitated. Professional ethics prevented her from discussing specific patients, but she'd learned over the years that Margaret was a good sounding board for the emotional challenges of her work. "I've got a patient who reminds me of myself at a certain age," Helen said carefully. "Young woman, pregnant, in a difficult marriage. It's bringing up old memories." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She'd been Helen's lifeline during the divorce from Harold, offering both emotional support and practical help when Helen needed a place to stay while she found her own apartment. "Are you taking care of yourself?" Margaret asked. "Sometimes helping. People who remind us of our past can open up wounds we thought were healed." "I'm fine," Helen said automatically, then caught herself. "Actually, I'm not sure that's true. This situation is affecting me more than it should. Maybe that's exactly why you're the right person to help her. You understand something her other healthcare providers might miss." After they hung up, Helen sat in her quiet apartment and acknowledged the truth Margaret had helped her recognize. Clara's situation wasn't just triggering memories. It was activating the part of Helen that had never fully healed from her own experience with domestic violence. She built a good life after leaving Harold. Her career was fulfilling. Her independence was precious. Her relationships were chosen rather than endured. But there remained a hollow place where trust used to live. A careful distance she maintained from situations that might require her to be vulnerable again. Helping Clara felt risky because it asked Helen to step back into the emotional territory of domestic violence, not as a distant professional, but as someone who remembered viscerally what it felt like to be trapped. But maybe that risk was also an opportunity. Maybe helping Clara find her way to safety could offer Helen a kind of closure she hadn't known she needed. As she prepared for bed, Helen made a decision. Tomorrow, she would begin assembling a comprehensive resource packet for Clara, not just phone numbers and brochures, but practical information about financial independence, legal rights, safety planning. Information that someone could review in private and act on when ready. She would also begin documenting Clara's situation more thoroughly, creating a medical record that could support legal action if Clara ever chose that path. Helen had learned that helping women in abusive relationships required patience, careful strategy, and absolute respect for their autonomy. She couldn't rescue Clara. No one could do that except Clara herself. But she could ensure that when Clara was ready to rescue herself, she would have the tools and knowledge necessary to succeed. It wasn't much, but it was what Helen had to offer. And sometimes, the right information delivered at the right moment could mean the difference between staying trapped and breaking free. The work of liberation, Helen had learned, often happened one small, careful step at a time. 2 weeks had passed since Clara's revelation at the clinic, and the careful equilibrium of her marriage had begun to shift in ways both subtle and profound. Marcus seemed to sense something different about her, though he couldn't identify exactly what had changed. His scrutiny intensified. Questions about her day became interrogations. Casual observations became accusations. Gestures of affection carried undertones of possession. "You seem distant lately," he said one evening over dinner, his tone suggesting this was Clara's failing rather than his perception. "Is everything all right with the baby?" Clara kept her eyes on her plate, calculating her response with the precision of someone who understood that wrong answers carried consequences. "I've just been tired. The doctor says that's normal in the second trimester. The body is working hard to support the baby's growth. It wasn't entirely a lie. She was tired, but not from pregnancy. She was exhausted from the constant vigilance required to maintain her performance of normalcy while nurturing the small, dangerous seed of autonomy that had been planted during her conversation with Helen. "Maybe you should rest more," Marcus suggested, but his version of rest meant staying home, avoiding outside contact, limiting opportunities for independent thought or action. "Cancel your appointment with Helen next week. You just saw her." Clara's fork paused halfway to her mouth. The appointment represented more than medical care. It was her only reliable access to someone who understood her situation. "I think I should keep it. She wants to monitor my blood pressure, and there's some concern about protein in my urine." This was a calculated response. Clara had learned over the years that medical terminology made Marcus uncomfortable, creating space for her to maintain necessary health care without extensive justification. What kind of concern? Marcus's attention sharpened immediately. He was possessive of Clara, but he was also genuinely worried about the baby. This pregnancy represented something precious to him: legacy, continuation, proof of his virility. At 45, nothing serious, Clara assured him. Just something they watch for in older mothers. Helen said it's routine monitoring. Marcus nodded, apparently satisfied. Clara had become expert at providing just enough medical detail to deflect his controlling instincts while appealing to his desire to protect their unborn child. But as she cleared the dinner dishes, Clara felt the weight of her careful deceptions. Each small lie, each strategic omission, each calculated response was building towards something she couldn't yet name. The woman who had once told Marcus everything: her thoughts, her fears, her daily experiences, was learning to cultivate privacy as a form of self-preservation. That night, after Marcus fell asleep, Clara allowed herself to retrieve Helen's card from its hiding place and memorize the number once again. She didn't call. The risk was too great with Marcus in the house, but holding those 10 digits in her mind felt like holding a lifeline. She wondered what Helen was doing at that moment. Whether she thought about their patients after hours, whether she remembered what it felt like to be pregnant and afraid, planning for a future that seemed both hopeful and terrifying. Helen, in fact, was thinking about Clara. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and a manila folder labeled Community Resources, a collection of information she'd been assembling over the past 2 weeks. Inside were brochures from domestic violence shelters, contact information for legal aid services, pamphlets about women's health during pregnancy, and a carefully researched list of employers in neighboring towns who might offer opportunities. For someone with Clara's background, Helen had also included something more personal, a handwritten letter she'd composed and rewritten several times, trying to find the right balance between professional support and personal understanding. "Dear Clara," the letter began, "I want you to know that whatever you decide about your situation, you deserve to feel safe and supported. The resources in this folder are here for when you're ready, not because I think you should use them immediately, but because having information can help you feel more in control of your choices. I also want you to know that I understand how complicated these decisions can be. When I was in a difficult marriage many years ago, I spent months gathering information before I felt ready to act on it. There's no timeline for this kind of courage. It happens when it happens, and only you can determine when that is. What I've learned is that knowledge is power, even when we're not ready to use that power yet. I hope these resources serve as a reminder that you have options, and that there are people in your corner when you're ready to explore them." The letter went on to detail practical considerations: how to open a bank account without a spouse's knowledge, what documentation would be necessary for emergency shelter placement, how to access legal protection if the situation escalated. Helen had been careful to present this information as educational rather than prescriptive. Understanding that Clara needed to feel agency in her own rescue, Helen planned to give Clara the folder during her next appointment, but only if the conversation felt right. Timing was everything in these situations. Pushed too hard, too fast, and women often retreated back into dangerous silence. Meanwhile, Clara's sister Jennifer called from Denver, their weekly check-in that had become one of Clara's few remain connections to a world beyond Marcus's oversight. "You sound different," Jennifer observed after they'd talked for a few minutes about the weather and the baby's development. "Is everything okay?" Clara glanced toward the living room where Marcus was watching television, calculating whether their conversation could be overheard. "Just pregnancy stuff. You know how it is, lots of changes." "Clara, can I ask you something?" Jennifer's voice carried the careful tone of someone approaching sensitive territory. "Are you happy?" The question landed like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that Clara couldn't immediately control. "Of course I'm happy. I'm having a baby. Marcus and I are doing well. That's not what I asked." The silence stretched between them across the miles. Clara could hear the television in the living room, the familiar sounds of Marcus settling in for the evening. She could hear the clock ticking in the kitchen, marking seconds of a life that felt increasingly like a performance. "I'm fine, Jen, really." "Okay," Jennifer said, but Clara could hear the doubt in her voice. "I just want you to know that if you ever need anything at all, I'm here. Denver's not that far away." After they hung up, Clara sat in the kitchen holding the phone and wondering what Jennifer had heard in her voice that made her ask such a direct question. Had Clara's careful facade begun to crack? Were the changes she felt inside becoming visible to others? The thought was both terrifying and oddly liberating. For years, Clara had worked so hard to convince everyone, including herself, that her marriage was normal, happy, worth preserving. If that performance was beginning to fail, maybe it meant she was finally ready to stop pretending. In the nursery, Clara added a small notebook to her growing cache of hidden supplies. Tonight, she would begin writing down the truth about her life, not the sanitized version she presented to the world, but the real story of her marriage, her fears, her slowly awakening determination to create something better for her child. Writing, she hoped, might help her find the words she would eventually need to speak out loud. The notebook became Clara's confessor. Hidden behind baby blankets and receiving gifts from well-meaning relatives, the small journal held truths Clara had never allowed herself to acknowledge fully. Each night, after Marcus fell asleep, she would slip into the nursery and write by the light of her phone, documenting not just incidents, but feelings. The fear that had become so constant, she'd stopped noticing it. The way she'd learned to read Marcus's moods in the set of his shoulders or the rhythm of his breathing. October 15th. He asked where I put the mail today. Said he'd left it on the kitchen counter, but I moved it to pay bills. Spent 20 minutes explaining why I moved it. Had to apologize for not asking first. This feels normal now. Apologizing for taking initiative in my own house. October 18th. Called me 3 times during grocery shopping to ask about specific items. How much they cost, why I needed them. Mrs. Henderson at checkout asked if everything was okay. Realized other people can see this isn't normal. Have I been performing this badly for 15 years? October 22nd. Baby is moving more now. Little kicks and rolls that remind me someone else is in this with me. What kind of world am I bringing this child into? What will I teach them about love if I stay? What will I teach them about courage if I go? The writing helped Clara see patterns she'd been too close to recognize. The way Marcus's control had tightened gradually over the years, so slowly that each new restriction felt like a natural evolution rather than a systematic erosion of her autonomy. The way she'd adapted to each limitation, finding workarounds and justifications until she'd forgotten what freedom felt like. But the notebook also revealed something else. Evidence of her own resilience. Small acts of resistance she'd dismissed as meaningless actually formed a pattern of survival. She'd maintain her relationship with Jennifer despite Marcus's disapproval. She'd continued reading books he considered frivolous. She preserved small spaces of independence, even while surrendering larger ones. Perhaps most importantly, she'd never stopped believing the baby deserved better. That maternal instinct, fierce and protective, was becoming the foundation for a kind of courage Clara hadn't known she possessed. Helen, meanwhile, had begun conducting her own form of documentation. During Clara's appointments, she carefully noted not just medical information, but observations about Clara's demeanor, questions that revealed her state of mind, subtle indicators of her safety and well-being. Patient appears increasingly anxious. About appointment duration. States husband worries when medical visits exceed expected time frame. Patient exhibits startled response to sudden noises. Defensive posturing when discussing home environment. Patient asked detailed questions about infant sleep patterns, feeding schedules, developmental milestones. Unusual level of detail for second trimester. Visit. When asked about support system at home, patient became vague. Changed subject to medical concerns. Patient presented with minor cut on hand, claimed kitchen accident. Wound pattern inconsistent with described cause. Patient deflected when asked about home. Safety precautions. Helen was building a careful record that could support Clara if she ever chose to pursue legal protection. But she was also documenting her own observations for therapeutic purposes. Sometimes, the act of naming patterns helped healthcare providers see situations more clearly, identify intervention opportunities that might otherwise be missed. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, during Clara's routine appointment, Helen made a decision that would change the trajectory of both their lives. "Clara, I've put together some information that might be helpful to you," Helen said, pulling out the manila folder she'd been preparing for weeks. "It's about community resources available during pregnancy parenting classes, nutrition programs, support groups. Would you like to take a look?" Clara accepted the folder with careful neutrality, but Helen noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she opened it. The top document was indeed about parenting classes, but underneath were the domestic violence resources Helen had researched so carefully. "This is very thorough," Clara said quietly, flipping through the pages without really reading them. "Thank you. There's no pressure to use any of these services," Helen said. "But I've learned over the years that it's good to know what's available, just in case circumstances change." Clara's eyes met Helen's briefly, and in that moment of connection, both women understood they were talking about much more than parenting classes and nutrition programs. "Can I keep this?" Clara asked. "Of course. Take your time looking through it, and Clara, my offer still stands. If you ever need to talk about anything, you have my number." That evening, Clara waited until Marcus was deeply asleep before examining the folder's contents by flashlight in the nursery. What she found, there was more than information. It was a roadmap to a different kind of life. The domestic violence shelter in the next county offered emergency housing for up to 30 days, with counseling services and job placement assistance. Legal aid services could help with protective orders and divorce proceedings at no cost. There were programs specifically designed to help pregnant women transition to independence, including temporary financial assistance and healthcare coverage. But it was Helen's letter that affected Clara most profoundly. Reading about Helen's own experience, seeing her journey from victim to survivor to healer, Clara began to imagine a future beyond mere escape. She began to envision recovery, rebuilding, the possibility of creating a life defined by choice rather than fear. "I spent months gathering information before I felt ready to act on it," Helen had written. There's no timeline for this kind of courage. Clara read that sentence 3 times, feeling something shift inside her chest. Permission to take her time. Permission to be strategic rather than impulsive. permission to trust her own timing while still moving towards safety. The next morning, Marcus noticed the folder. "What's that?" he asked, nodding toward the kitchen counter where Clara had accidentally left it while making breakfast. "Information from the clinic," Clara said, her heart racing even as she kept her voice steady. "About parenting classes and nutrition programs. Helen thought we might be interested." Marcus picked up the folder and flipped through it casually. Clara held her breath, knowing that if he looked too carefully, he would find the domestic violence resources Helen had included. "Looks like a lot of touchy-feely nonsense," Marcus said, tossing the folder back onto the counter. "We don't need strangers telling us how to raise our child." "Of course not," Clara agreed. "I just thought it was nice that they offered." But as Marcus left for work, Clara realized something significant had just happened. She'd successfully maintained possession of information that could change her life. She'd protected her access to resources without arousing his suspicion. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. That afternoon, Clara made her first phone call to the domestic violence hotline. She didn't give her name or ask for help. She simply listened as a trained counselor explained services available to women in her situation. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but it represented a crucial step. Clara was no longer just gathering information. She was beginning to imagine herself using it. The baby kicked as she hung up the phone, a little flutter of movement. That felt like encouragement. Clara placed her hand on her belly and made a silent promise. By the time this child was born, she would know exactly what kind of world she was bringing them into. And if that world wasn't safe enough, she would be prepared to create a better one. Clara's carefully constructed world collapsed on a Tuesday morning in early November when Marcus announced he'd been laid off from the construction company where he'd worked for 12 years. "Budget cuts," he said, standing in their kitchen with his final paycheck and a cardboard box of personal items from his desk. They kept the younger guys, the ones without families to support, said it was nothing personal. But Clara could see it was deeply personal to Marcus. His identity was tied to his role as provider, protector, the man who made the decisions because he carried the financial responsibility. Without work, without that external validation of his authority, she could already sense him turning inward, seeking other ways to assert control. "I'm sorry," Clara said carefully, unsure what response he wanted from her. Over 15 years of marriage, she'd learned to read his moods, but unemployment was uncharted territory. "I know how much that job meant to you." "Don't," Marcus snapped, his tone sharper than she'd expected. "Don't you dare start with sympathy. This is temporary. I'll find something else." But as the days passed, Clara watched Marcus's frustration grow. He spent hours on the internet applying for jobs that didn't call back, networking with contacts who had their own financial pressures, driving to construction sites that weren't hiring. Each rejection seemed to feed an anger that had nowhere productive to go. The first sign of what was coming appeared on Thursday when Clara returned from grocery shopping to find Marcus going through her purse. "What are you doing?" she asked, trying to keep accusation out of her voice. "Checking receipts. We need to watch every penny now." He pulled out her wallet, counting the remaining cash with the intensity of someone auditing a business. "You spent $47. On what?" Clara had saved the receipt, knowing this conversation was coming. "Groceries for the week. Milk, bread, eggs, vegetables. I can show you everything." But Marcus wasn't really questioning her purchases. He was establishing new rules, new boundaries, tighter control now that his external source of authority had been removed. The interrogation about groceries was just the beginning. By the following week, Clara was required to account for every dollar spent, every minute away from the house, every phone call received or made. Marcus had positioned himself as the household's financial manager, a role that gave him justification for monitoring every aspect of Clara's life. "We can't afford your clinic appointments anymore," he announced one evening. I looked into it. We can get basic prenatal care at the county health department for free. Clara's blood ran cold. The county health department meant different doctors, different nurses, no relationship with Helen, no access to the one person who understood her situation and could provide help when she was ready to accept it. "My insurance covers the appointments," Clara said carefully, "and Helen knows my medical history. It might be risky to change providers this late in the pregnancy." "We can't afford the copays," Marcus replied with finality. "Every $25 matters now." But Clara suspected this decision had less to do with money and more to do with control. Marcus had always been suspicious of her relationship with Helen, sensing perhaps that their connection went beyond routine medical care. Now he had financial justification for severing that lifeline. "What if there are complications?" Clara asked. "Helen has been monitoring my blood pressure, and there were some concerns about protein levels. The county health department can monitor blood pressure just fine. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be." That night, Clara lay awake calculating. She had maybe 3 weeks before her next scheduled appointment with Helen. 3 weeks to figure out how to maintain that crucial connection despite Marcus's new restrictions. 3 weeks to decide whether she was ready to act on the information Helen had provided, or whether she would lose her window of opportunity. The decision was made for her the following Friday. Clara was folding laundry in the nursery when she heard Marcus on the phone in the kitchen, his voice carrying the edge it took on when he was arguing with customer service representatives or challenging decisions he considered unfair. "That's right. I want to cancel my wife's appointments," he was saying. "All future appointments. We're switching to a different provider." Clara's hands stilled on the tiny onesie she'd been folding. He was calling the clinic directly, canceling her care without consulting her, making medical decisions for her and their unborn child based on his need to assert control rather than any genuine financial necessity. She crept closer to the kitchen, staying out of sight but close enough to hear his side of the conversation. "No, she doesn't need to call herself. I'm her husband. I make the medical decisions for our family." Clara heard Helen's voice on the other end of the line, though she couldn't make out the words. Whatever Helen was saying, it was making Marcus increasingly agitated. "Look, lady, I don't need a lecture about patient rights. My wife is pregnant, I'm unemployed, and we can't afford your fancy clinic anymore. Cancel the appointments." A longer pause, then Marcus's voice rising. "No, you cannot speak to her directly. She's resting, and I'm handling our medical arrangements now. Just cancel the damn appointments." Clara heard the phone slam down, followed by Marcus's heavy footsteps moving toward the living room. She quickly returned to the nursery and resumed folding baby clothes, her hands trembling as she processed what had just happened. Marcus had cut her off from Helen entirely. No more appointments, no more access to the one person who understood her situation and could help her navigate her options. He'd done it efficiently, decisively, using his status as her husband to override her own medical autonomy. But what Marcus didn't know was that Clara now carried Helen's phone number memorized in her head and a folder full of resources hidden in the nursery. He'd taken away her official connection to help, but he hadn't eliminated her access entirely. More importantly, his actions had clarified something Clara had been struggling to accept. Marcus saw her not as a partner in their marriage, but as a possession to be managed. His unemployment hadn't created his controlling behavior. It had simply removed the external constraints that had kept that behavior within socially acceptable bounds. Clara continued folding baby clothes with mechanical precision while her mind raced through calculations. She had perhaps 15 weeks until the baby was born. Marcus's unemployment benefits would last 6 months, but his desperation and need to control would likely escalate long before then. The carefully measured timeline She'd been following, gathering information, building resources. Waiting for the right moment had just been compressed dramatically. Marcus had forced her hand without realizing it. That evening, after Marcus fell asleep in front of the television, Clara retrieved her notebook from its hiding place and wrote, November 18th. Marcus canceled my appointments with Helen without asking me. Says we can't afford the clinic anymore, but I think he's cutting off my access to help. His unemployment is making him more controlling, not less. The baby deserves better than this. I deserve better than this. Time to stop gathering information and start using it. For the first time in months, Clara wrote without fear of discovery. If Marcus found the notebook now, it would simply confirm what his own actions had already revealed. Their marriage had become a prison, and Clara was ready to start planning her escape. The baby kicked against her ribs as she wrote, a strong movement that felt like agreement. Time was running short, but Clara finally understood what Helen had meant about courage, arriving on its own timeline. Her timeline had just accelerated dramatically, and she was ready to meet it. The week following Marcus's cancellation of her medical appointments passed in a careful dance of preparation and pretense. Clara maintained her routine of domestic compliance while secretly putting pieces in place for what she was beginning. To understand would be an inevitable confrontation with the life she'd built. Helen, meanwhile, had been deeply disturbed by Marcus's phone call. In 30 years of nursing, she'd encountered controlling spouses before, but rarely had she witnessed such a blatant assertion of medical authority over an adult woman. The conversation had stayed with her through the weekend, prompting her to take action she'd never taken before. On Monday morning, Helen called Clara's house. Hello? Clara answered cautiously, recognizing the clinic's number on the caller ID. Clara, this is Helen. I wanted to follow up on your husband's call last week about canceling your appointments. Clara glanced toward the living room where Marcus was watching morning news, then spoke quietly into the phone. Yes, we've decided to switch to the county health department. Financial reasons. I understand financial pressures, Helen said carefully, but I'm concerned about continuity of care. Would it be possible for you to come in for one final appointment? Just to transfer your records properly and make sure the transition goes smoothly? Clara's heart raced. Helen was offering her exactly what she needed. One more opportunity for connection, for planning, for finalizing the resources she would need. But arranging such an appointment without Marcus's knowledge would require careful strategy. I'm not sure that's necessary, Clara said, aware that Marcus could overhear her side of the conversation. It would really help ensure your baby's health and safety, Helen pressed gently. I could schedule it for this Thursday afternoon. The visit would be brief, focused entirely on medical records transfer. Clara understood the coded language. Thursday afternoon, when Marcus would likely be out job hunting or meeting with potential employers. A brief visit that could accomplish much more than medical records transfer. I'll have to check my schedule, Clara said. Of course, you can call me back when you've had a chance to think about it. After hanging up, Clara told Marcus that the clinic had called about transferring her medical records to the county health department. They want me to come in for a final appointment to make sure the transition goes smoothly, she said. Something about ensuring continuity of care for the baby. Marcus considered this, his unemployed state making him more suspicious of any activity. That took Clara away from the house. How long would it take? She said it would be brief, maybe 30 minutes. I should come with you. Make sure they're not trying to talk you into continuing care we can't afford. Clara's stomach clenched, but she forced her voice to remain steady. You don't need to take time away from job searching. It's really just paperwork, signing release forms and collecting my file. Marcus nodded, apparently satisfied. His focus was entirely on finding new employment, and Clara had learned to frame her requests in terms of not interfering with that priority. Over the next 3 days, Clara finalized her emergency preparations with the focused intensity of someone who understood her window of opportunity was narrowing rapidly. She added the last of her small cash savings to the stash hidden in the nursery. She researched bus schedules to neighboring towns. She memorized the phone numbers for the domestic violence shelter and legal aid services Helen had provided. Most importantly, she wrote a letter. Not to Marcus. That conversation would happen face to face when the time was right. The letter was to herself, a document she could read if her courage faltered, if fear tried to convince her to retreat back into familiar patterns of compromise and accommodation. Clara, she wrote, by the time you read this, you will be scared. You will be tempted to change your mind, to convince yourself that things aren't really that bad, that you can make this marriage work for the baby's sake. But remember why you're doing this. Remember the way you flinch when he comes home angry. Remember explaining your bruises to yourself because the truth was too frightening to acknowledge. Remember the baby moving inside you and your desperate wish that they never learn to live with fear as their default emotion. You are not leaving because you are weak. You are leaving because you are finally strong enough to admit that love should not require you to disappear. This baby deserves a mother who stands up for herself. You deserve a life where your own judgment matters. The woman who survived her first marriage and found the courage to leave can survive this too. Be brave. Be smart. Be safe. But don't be sorry. Thursday afternoon arrived gray and cold, with the kind of November weather that made staying inside seem reasonable and necessary. Clara told Marcus she was leaving for her appointment at 2:30, giving herself extra time in case traffic was heavy or she needed a few minutes to compose herself before facing Helen. Remember, this is just about transferring records, Marcus said as she gathered her purse and coat. Don't let them pressure you into additional services. I understand, Clara replied. I'll be home by 4 o'clock. But as Clara drove toward the clinic, she carried with her the knowledge that everything might change in the next few hours, depending on what Helen had arranged, depending on Clara's own readiness to take decisive action. She might not be coming home at all. The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Helen was waiting in the examination room when Clara arrived, but she wasn't alone. A woman in her 40s with kind eyes and professional attire sat in the extra chair. Someone Clara didn't recognize, but who clearly belonged in this carefully orchestrated moment. Clara, I'd like you to meet Sarah Martinez, Helen said. She's a social worker with the county domestic violence program. I asked her to be here today because I thought you might benefit from hearing about some additional resources available to you. Clara's immediate instinct was to retreat, to claim she didn't need such resources, to maintain the fiction that had protected her for so long. But looking at these two women, Helen, who had survived her own difficult marriage, and Sarah, who clearly dedicated her career to helping women in similar situations, Clara felt something shift inside her chest. She was tired of pretending. Tired of protecting Marcus's reputation at the expense of her own safety. Tired of being grateful for the absence of worse treatment instead of expecting actual kindness. What kind of resources? Clara asked quietly. Sarah's response was practical, specific, grounded in real-world logistics rather than abstract encouragement. She talked about emergency shelter placement, temporary financial assistance, job training programs, childcare support for single mothers. She explained legal protections available to pregnant women, healthcare coverage for those transitioning away from abusive relationships, counseling services designed specifically for mothers concerned about breaking cycles of domestic violence. The most important thing to understand, Sarah said, is that leaving safely requires planning. We can help with that planning, but the timeline has to be yours. We can provide resources and support, but the decisions have to come from you. Clara listened with the careful attention of someone who understood she was receiving information that could save her life. But she also found herself thinking about Marcus alone at home. scrolling through job listings and growing more frustrated with each rejection. What happens to them? Clara asked. To the men, I mean, after women leave. That's not your responsibility, Sarah said gently but firmly. Your responsibility is to your own safety and your child's well-being. What he does with his life after you're gone is his choice to make. Helen leaned forward slightly. Clara, can you tell us honestly, do you feel safe at home right now? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Clara could deflect it, minimize it, provide the careful non-answer she perfected over years of similar inquiries. Or she could tell the truth. No, Clara said quietly. I don't feel safe. And I'm afraid of what will happen after the baby is born. I'm afraid of what my child will learn about love by watching our marriage. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and irreversible. But instead of falling, Clara felt something else. Relief. After years of carrying the weight of unspoken truth, she had finally said the words out loud. Helen and Sarah exchanged a glance, and Clara understood that this moment had been carefully planned, that these two women had anticipated exactly this conversation and prepared accordingly. What do you need from us? Helen asked. Clara took a deep breath, feeling the baby move inside her as if responding to her mother's moment of courage. I need to know how to do this safely, for both of us. The next hour changed everything. Clara returned home at exactly 4 p.m., as promised, carrying herself with the careful composure of someone who had just made the most important decision of her life. In her purse, hidden beneath grocery receipts and prenatal vitamins, was a safety plan written in Sarah's careful handwriting, and a prepaid cell phone Helen had pressed into her hands at the last moment. Everything go smoothly? Marcus asked from his position at the kitchen table, where job applications were spread across the surface, like evidence of his diminishing prospects. Fine, Clara replied, hanging her coat in the closet with deliberate normalcy. They transferred my records and gave me some paperwork about prenatal care at the county health department. She pulled out legitimate documents. Sarah had provided information about county health services, appointment scheduling procedures, standard pregnancy care protocols. If Marcus chose to examine them, he would find exactly what he expected to see. But hidden beneath those official papers was something else entirely. A detailed plan for leaving safely, contact numbers for emergency services, and a timeline that would unfold over the next 72 hours. Good, Marcus said, barely, looking up from his applications. One less expense to worry about. Clara moved through the familiar choreography of preparing dinner, her hands steady despite the seismic shift that had occurred in her understanding of the immediate future. In 3 days, if everything went according to the plan she'd helped create, she would be gone. The baby she carried would be born into a different world entirely, one without the constant undercurrent of tension that had defined their household for years. The safety plan was specific, practical, grounded in the hard-won wisdom of women who had navigated similar escapes. Friday morning, Marcus would leave for a job interview he'd scheduled in the neighboring county, a drive that would keep him away for at least 3 hours. Clara would use that window to gather essential documents, pack a single bag, and leave. For the domestic violence shelter where Sarah had already arranged temporary placement, the timing was crucial. Too early, and Marcus might return unexpectedly. Too late, and Clara would lose her nerve or find excuses to delay. Sarah had emphasized that leaving required decisive action within a specific window of opportunity. Hesitation could be dangerous. The hardest part, Sarah had explained, is accepting that you can't control his reaction. You can only control your own actions and your own safety. That evening, Clara began her preparations with the methodical precision of someone who understood. There would be no second chances. While Marcus watched television, she quietly located their important documents: her birth certificate, social security card, marriage certificate, insurance papers, bank account information. She photographed each document with the prepaid phone Helen had given her, then returned the originals to their usual locations in the nursery. She packed a small bag with essential items for herself and the baby clothes, toiletries, medications, a few precious mementos that represented the life she hoped to build rather than the one she was leaving behind. The bag went into the trunk of her car, hidden beneath a blanket and positioned so Marcus wouldn't notice it during his casual inspections of their shared space. Wednesday passed in a suspension of normalcy that felt both surreal and hyperreal. Clara went through the motions of their usual routine, while secretly saying goodbye to the house where she'd spent 15 years learning to make herself smaller. Every room held memories of compromise, accommodation, and the gradual erosion of her own judgment in favor of Marcus's preferences. But the nursery felt different. Here, surrounded by tiny clothes and carefully chosen furniture, Clara could envision a future that had nothing to do with their current circumstances. This baby would never know the particular silence that follows raised voices. Would never learn to read adult moods for signs of approaching danger. Would never accept emotional volatility as an expression of love. Thursday morning brought unexpected complications. Marcus's job interview was rescheduled for the afternoon due to a conflict in the interviewer's schedule. Clara received this news with carefully controlled disappointment, understanding that her window of opportunity had shifted but not disappeared. "I'll probably be gone from about 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock, Marcus said, reviewing the directions he'd printed from the internet. "Interviews at 2:30, but I want to allow extra time to find the place and maybe grab lunch nearby." Clara nodded, recalculating her timeline. 3 hours was still enough, but the afternoon departure meant she would have less flexibility if unexpected. Delays occurred. "I hope it goes well," she said, and meant it. Marcus's professional success had always been easier for both of them than his frustration and unemployment. But his future career prospects were no longer her responsibility to manage or worry about. "It will," Marcus replied with the confidence of someone who had never seriously considered that his wife might have plans that didn't include him. "This company's growing fast. Lots of opportunities for advancement. We'll be back on our feet within a month." Clara listened to him plan their shared future mortgage, payments and vacation possibilities and preparations for the baby's arrival while carrying in her heart the knowledge that she would not be part of those plans. The cognitive dissonance was almost overwhelming. That afternoon, Clara stood at the kitchen window and watched Marcus drive away to what would be their final normal interaction. He would return from his interview to find an empty house and a letter explaining why she couldn't stay. By then, she would be safely away, beginning the complicated process of building a new life. The moment his truck disappeared around the corner, Clara moved with the focused efficiency of someone whose survival depended on perfect execution. Documents from her purse, bag from the car trunk. One last walk through the house to ensure she hadn't forgotten anything essential. In the nursery, she placed her hand on her belly and spoke quietly to the baby who would soon inherit the consequences of this decision. "I'm doing this for you," she whispered. "I'm doing this so you never have to learn that love and fear are supposed to go together." The baby responded with a strong kick, as if offering encouragement for the journey ahead. Clara took a deep breath, picked up her bag, and walked toward the door that would take her from the life she'd known to the life she was determined to create. The drive to the domestic violence shelter felt like traveling through time itself, each mile taking Clara further from the woman she had been and closer to the woman she was choosing to become. Her hands were steady on the steering wheel, but her heart hammered against her ribs with a rhythm that seemed to echo the baby's movements inside her. The shelter was located in a converted house on the outskirts of the neighboring town, deliberately nondescript to protect the safety of its residents. Sarah Martinez met Clara in the parking lot, her presence both professional and deeply human in a way that made Clara understood she was no longer navigating this transition alone. "How are you feeling?" Sarah asked as they walked toward the entrance. "Terrified," Clara answered honestly, "but also relieved." "Is that strange?" "Not at all. Most women feel exactly that way." Inside, the shelter buzzed with the quiet activity of women and children creating temporary safety in an uncertain world. Clara was shown to a small but clean room with 2 single beds, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto a carefully maintained garden where several children played under the watchful eye of a staff member. "This will be your space for as long as you need it," Sarah explained. "The maximum stay is 30 days, but most women transition to more permanent housing within 2 to 3 weeks. We'll work together on finding you an apartment, job opportunities, childcare arrangements for after the baby comes." Clara sat on one of the beds, feeling the weight of what she had just done settling around her like a heavy blanket. In the space of 3 hours, she had dismantled 15 years of shared life and committed herself to an uncertain future as a single mother. "What happens now?" Clara asked. "Now you rest. You've taken the hardest step. Everything else we can figure out together." But even as Sarah spoke those reassuring words, Clara's phone, her regular phone, not the prepaid one Helen had given her, began to ring. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and Clara's blood turned to ice water. "He's home early," Clara whispered. Sarah moved quickly to the window, checking the parking lot for any signs of an angry husband who might have followed his wife to her place of refuge. "Are you sure you weren't followed here?" "I don't think so. I watched the entire drive. But he might have finished his interview early, or maybe it was canceled." The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. Clara stared at it as if it were a dangerous animal, knowing that answering would mean confronting Marcus's rage and confusion, but understanding that not answering might escalate his panic and make him more dangerous. "I have to talk to him," Clara said. "You don't have to do anything," Sarah replied firmly. "But if you choose to talk to him, you don't have to tell him where you are." Clara answered on the 5th ring, her voice carefully controlled despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Clara, where are you?" Marcus's voice carried a tone she'd never heard before, not just anger, but genuine bewilderment. "I came home, and you're gone. Your clothes are missing. What the hell is going on?" "I left, Marcus. I can't live like this anymore." The silence that followed was so complete, Clara wondered if the call had been disconnected. Then Marcus spoke again, his voice shifting from confusion to the kind of controlled fury she recognized all too well. "You can't just leave. You're pregnant. You're my wife. We have responsibilities to each other. I left you a letter explaining everything. It's on the kitchen table." "I don't want a letter, Clara. I want you to come home right now. We can work through whatever this is about." Clara could hear in his voice the beginning of the negotiation phase Sarah had warned her about. The promises to change, the minimization of past problems, the suggestions that pregnancy hormones were affecting her judgment, all of it designed to undermine her certainty and draw her back into familiar patterns. "I'm not coming home, Marcus. This isn't a negotiation. The hell it isn't. You're carrying my child. You can't just take my baby and disappear." For the first time in their conversation, Clara felt her own anger rising to meet his. This baby deserves to grow up in a house where people don't hurt each other, where love doesn't come with fear attached. "I never hurt you," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, you did. And you know you did. And I'm not going to let you hurt our child." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, Marcus cycling through anger, pleading, threats, and promises with the desperate intensity of someone whose entire world had just shifted without warning. Clara listened with the strange detachment of someone who had finally stepped outside a familiar prison and could see its walls clearly for the first time. When she finally hung up, her hands were shaking, but her resolve remained intact. That was incredibly brave, Sarah said quietly. It was necessary, Clara replied, for both of us. That evening, as Clara lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of other women and children navigating their own transitions to safety, she felt the baby move inside her strong, insistent kicks that seemed to approve of the day's decisions. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, practical concerns about housing and employment, and legal protection. But tonight, for the first time in years, Clara fell asleep without listening for footsteps in the hallway or monitoring someone else's breathing. For signs of mood and intention, she slept like someone who had finally come home to herself. 3 months later, Clara stood in the doorway of her small apartment, watching her newborn daughter sleep in the crib that Helen had helped her assemble. Emma Rose had arrived 2 weeks early, as if eager to enter the world Clara had worked so hard to create for her, a world defined by choice rather than fear, by love that felt safe rather than dangerous. The apartment was modest, a 2-bedroom unit in a complex that catered to young families and provided the kind of community support Clara had never known she needed. Her neighbors included other single mothers, young couples starting their lives together, elderly residents who delighted in holding babies and offering unsolicited but kindly meant advice about everything from sleep schedules to teething remedies. Clara had found work at the local library, a position that felt like returning to an earlier version of herself, the young woman who had once dreamed of moving to the city, who had believed in the power of books to transport and transform lives. The hours were flexible enough to accommodate Emma's needs, and the work provided both income and the intellectual stimulation Clara had forgotten she craved. The legal proceedings with Marcus had been complicated but ultimately successful. With Sarah's guidance and the documentation Helen had carefully maintained, Clara had obtained a protective order that ensured her safety while establishing Marcus's parental rights in a controlled, supervised framework. He could see Emma twice a month, but only at a family visitation center where trained staff monitored interactions and ensured the baby's well-being. Marcus had struggled with unemployment for several more months before finding work with a construction company 3 towns away. Clara knew this only because their court-mandated communication about Emma occasionally included updates about his life. He had attended anger management counseling as required by the custody agreement, and while Clara couldn't know whether the sessions had created lasting change, the Marcus who appeared for supervised visits seemed quieter, more thoughtful, less certain of his own authority. But the most significant transformation had been Clara's own. The woman who had once apologized for moving mail now made decisions with confidence born of necessity and practice. She had learned to trust her own judgment about everything from Emma's feeding schedule to her choice of friends to her plans for the future. Helen visited regularly, bringing medical expertise during Emma's early weeks and evolving into something between mentor and chosen family as Clara adjusted to motherhood. Their relationship had deepened beyond the professional boundaries that had defined their initial connection, rooted now in mutual respect and the shared understanding of women who had both found the courage to choose themselves over harmful situations. She looks like you, Helen observed during one of her visits, studying Emma's delicate features as the baby slept peacefully in Clara's arms. I hope she'll be stronger than I was, Clara replied. You were always strong. You just needed to remember it. The conversation turned, as it often did, to practical matters, Emma's developmental milestones, Clara's return to work after maternity leave, plans for transitioning from the temporary financial assistance that had helped her establish independence. But underneath the logistics was a deeper satisfaction both women felt about the outcome of their careful collaboration. Months earlier, Clara had not just escaped an abusive marriage, she had built a foundation for a completely different kind of life. Emma would grow up watching her mother make thoughtful decisions, maintain healthy relationships, pursue personal interests alongside parental responsibilities. The baby would learn that love could be fierce and protective without being possessive or controlling. "I want to show you something," Clara said, rising carefully from the couch where they'd been talking. She retrieved a photo album from the bookshelf, one she'd been creating since Emma's birth. The album contained pictures of Emma's first weeks, but also images that told the story of Clara's new life, her small apartment filled with books and plants, Emma sleeping peacefully in her crib, Clara at work surrounded by children who came to the library for story time, casual moments with neighbors who had become friends. "This is what I want her to remember," Clara explained. "Not that we left her father, but that we chose a life where she could be safe and loved and free to become whoever she's meant to be." Helen studied the photographs with the careful attention of someone who understood their significance. Each image represented a moment of normalcy that Clara had fought to create, a life rebuilt from the ground up with intention and hope. "You did something remarkable," Helen said quietly. "You saved both of your lives." As winter gave way to spring, Clara began making plans for Emma's first birthday. The celebration would be small. Helen, Sarah, a few neighbors who had become dear friends, Clara's sister Jennifer, who was planning to visit from Denver. No elaborate party, just a gathering of people who understood what this milestone represented. Emma was thriving in ways that went beyond typical developmental markers. She was a happy baby, curious and responsive, unafraid of sudden noises or unexpected movements. She smiled easily and slept peacefully, as if some fundamental trust in the world's safety had been preserved intact. Looking at her daughter, Clara sometimes thought about the alternate future they had avoided. Emma growing up in a house where tension was normal, where she might have learned to read adult moods for signs of danger, where love came mixed with fear and unpredictability. Instead, Emma was learning that the world could be trusted to meet her needs, that the adults in her life were reliable sources of comfort and care, that love was something that made people feel safer rather than more afraid. On a warm day in late spring, Clara sat in the small garden behind her apartment building, watching Emma discover grass and flowers with the intense fascination that babies brought to every new experience. The afternoon sun felt like a blessing on her face, and Clara allowed herself a moment of pure contentment. She thought about the woman who had walked into Helen's clinic months earlier, swollen ear hidden beneath carefully applied makeup, carrying secrets too heavy for one person to bear alone. That woman had been brave in ways she didn't recognize, surviving day by day in circumstances that required tremendous strength just to endure. But this woman, the one who had chosen to leave, who had rebuilt her life from scratch, who was raising Emma with the kind of intentional love that created safety rather than fear. This woman was brave in a different way. She had learned that courage wasn't just about enduring difficult circumstances, but about recognizing when those circumstances needed to change. Emma looked up at her mother with the bright, trusting gaze of a child who had never known anything but love that felt safe. In those eyes, Clara saw not just her daughter's future, but her own a life defined by choices made with wisdom and courage, by love that enhanced rather than diminished the people it touched. The baby reached for a dandelion with tiny, determined fingers, and Clara guided her gently toward the flower, teaching her how to explore the world without fear. It was a small lesson, but Clara understood it was also the foundation for everything else. Emma would learn about living in the world with confidence and joy. This was the gift Clara had fought so hard to give her daughter, the knowledge that she was loved unconditionally, protected fiercely, and free to become exactly who she was meant to be.